All right, we're going to look at the lives of ordinary Europeans in the 18th century, looking at kind of families, children, education, literature, these sorts of trends, and recognizing how they change. And it's really important that as we look at this, we recognize that this massive change in European society is a direct result of both the Enlightenment and the agricultural revolution. And this really transforms European society. And what we're seeing here is kind of this bridging era from the late Middle Ages into industrialization. So we're seeing trends beginning to change, and that's worth noting that this happens in the 18th century, towards the latter end of the 18th century, when the agricultural revolution and the Enlightenment ideas have really taken hold and transformed Europe. So we'll look at a few different areas today. First, we'll look at family life. And what happens in Europe, it's kind of a unique continent in that people generally live with only their nuclear families. That is, they're not living with extended families. There's not many three-generation households, large clans living together. It's mostly just a husband and wife and their children. Occasionally, if a parent needs to move in to be supported later in life, that will happen. But you don't have huge families living together. And this is in part a result of this later marriage. So in the 17th and 18th century, people are getting married later in life. And the reason they're doing so is because before they get married, they need to know that they're able to financially support themselves. And so in this era, most people made their living off the land. So they're not able to move out until they're able to have land. And that's not happening until parents pass away. So you see this trend where people wait until their parents die, inherit the land, and then get married. And then at that point, they can have children. And this kind of later marriage and ebb and flow helps to maintain a balance of people and the amount of land, food, and supplies that are available. So you see a lot of continuity here in that people are really afraid to strike out on their own because their only way of making a living really is through farming. And so they kind of wait until they know they'll be able to acquire land. Now this starts to change, and we'll look at kind of how that starts to change. But it's worth keeping that in mind, that we're seeing people wait to get married until later in life, wait to move out on their own until they're economically self-sufficient. And that's reliant upon land they inherit from their parents. In terms of work, we have people working all the time, and all the people are working. So at a typical household, the father might be in charge of the farming, the young son would be tending the animals or helping the father plant, the wife would be working domestically to produce clothes or some other potential cottage industry, but she would also be working out in the fields, helping to plant and manage the animals. And the daughters would be helping around the house as well as in the field. So you have a lot of this. All these families are contributing. Everyone is contributing. As the 18th century moves on, though, we begin to see a shift in the way things are done. And so oftentimes boys are sent out to go earn wages, either as a wage laborer, where they're doing kind of odds and end jobs, not generally the best jobs, not the jobs you want to be working in, but enough to kind of bring home some money. Or they're apprenticed out, so they're sent to go work under the blacksmith to learn a trade. And often they would do that with boys if there were multiple siblings within a family. That way they would have a way that they knew they could earn money rather than relying on inheriting this farmland. The young women were oftentimes sent as domestic servants, and so they would go work in the houses of the nobility as maids, as servants. And here they run into a few major issues. First is that they're overworked. There's not any respect given to these lower classes, and so they're expected to work long hours, do difficult tasks, and really work to no end. And secondly, they're very often sexually assaulted by the men of the house, in that these aristocrats, the wealthy nobility, feel that they have a right to their maids. And so you have this real power and misogynistic viewpoint from the men, feeling that they are almost owed these sexual acts from the women who they bring into their house. So working as a domestic servant is often not a pleasant experience for these young women, and if they happen to get pregnant, they're immediately fired and let go. So it's really a no-win situation. The upside is that they do earn a wage that can be sent back home either to their parents or that they can take in order to help strike out and to make a living. In terms of marriage, we're seeing that there's this change in marriage, and so we mentioned earlier that people had been getting married kind of later in life, but before they're getting married, we're seeing this real spike in illegitimate children. Your book quotes some figures, but it goes up rapidly, I think implying that in one area, a full third of babies born are illegitimate or outside of marriage. And so you have really this kind of sexual revolution that's happening. You have this huge number of illegitimate children, and this is in part due to changing social structures and social norms. These people who engage in the cottage industry find that they're no longer reliant on inheriting land from their parents in order to make money, but now they can make money and become economically self-sufficient by producing things in their houses. And so they're able to marry younger because they're self-sufficient. They don't need the farm. They just continue to weave or to make whatever it is they're making in their homes, be able to sell it, and be able to support themselves. So we see them starting to marry younger. And because they're economically self-sufficient, they're not relying on land, you start to see the reasons for marriage shift. So before this time, marriage was done mostly as an economic agreement, where you were trying to find a way to survive, or you would try to marry your son or daughter off to a place where they could be economically safe or comfortable. But now that people are able to make money through a variety of ways, they don't have to worry necessarily about marrying for economic reasons, but they can marry now for love or for flirtation or for other reasons besides just money. You also have a changing dynamic in that people are moving out of the countryside and into cities and towns, and so they're experiencing new things. Their dating pool is larger. They're able to have more experiences, and so this really changes relationships, it changes sexuality, and it changes marriages. Now we get to the tough issue of children. In the 16 and 1700s, children are expensive. They're difficult to take care of. They require a lot of attention, a lot of food, and they have a lot of needs. And it's really important that as we go through here, we recognize that this concept of childhood as we have it today simply does not exist in this time period. There's no sense of this era where children are somehow different. They're just viewed as little adults in this era. So they're not coddled. They're not viewed any differently. There's no pediatricians. They're just doctors for everybody. There's no sense of child development or any of that sort of thing. They're just seen as kind of all the same. And so this really opens itself up to some really bad things, if you will, in that parents who simply aren't able to afford their children oftentimes kill them, and that's what we call infanticide, the killing of infants. And this kind of had been common-ish practice during the Middle Ages and before, but as we move through the 1700s and as Enlightenment thought comes through and people start to kind of change, this is kind of viewed as not really where humans should be going if we're trying to move towards a more developed society. So there are some laws against it. What you see is parents find ways to have convenient, quote, accidents where their children die, sometimes rolling over them and suffocating them, leaving them out in the woods, various things of that sort. And so it's really tough. It's really kind of a brutal time period. The upper class don't really want to take care of their children, so they'll hire what are known as wet nurses. Those would be peasants or lower class people who had children right around the same time, so the women are lactating and are able to breastfeed. And so the upper class don't breastfeed their children. They basically hire a maid in to do so for them. And what happens is these women sometimes get a bad reputation because, as tended to happen back then, children would often die due to malnutrition, due to disease, due to just being a child and not having proper sanitation. And so these upper class women would naturally blame the wet nurses they had brought in. And so you have this rise of this term, these killing nurses, this kind of creepy underground group of young women who are trying to kill all these babies. It's really akin to that witch craze that we'd seen in Europe earlier. So that's going on. And at the same time, we have this new development of something called a foundling home, which is essentially an orphanage. And they would take care of children who had been abandoned. And this is nice, and it's a good development, so these children aren't just abandoned out in the woods. But what you see is these massive growth of these houses that are simply unable to care for these children. Your book gives the example of one in St. Petersburg that takes in 5,000 children a year at its peak. We're talking that's 13, 14 kids a day who are being dropped off here. So there's almost this sense of, well, you can have a child and then just go drop it off somewhere else and it's not your responsibility. But in these places, you have high rates of death. Most children are not surviving past infancy or childhood still, and those that are sometimes are just sent to work in factories. In fact, when factories come about, when we look at industrialization, the first place they look for labor are these foundling homes and these orphanages, because it's a way where they can get cheap labor in, and the people who own them can profit. These also become a nice charity for the wealthy people to donate money to feel good about themselves. They pretend like they're helping the poor by donating money to these places, although often they're just areas where adults can take advantage of children and force them to work so the adults get paid and the children get nothing. So you have these kind of conflicting views of this foundling home. One, that it's helping these children who would otherwise be dumped and left for dead, but at the flip side of that is they're being taken advantage of as they get older, and it's not exactly the best area to be raised as a child. And as I mentioned, there's not this concept of childhood. They're just viewed as adults who should be working. And because children die so often, the parents simply don't get attached to them. There's no emotional connection because it's an expectation that these children won't live beyond 12. So why would you get attached to them? An outcome of that is a high rate of child abuse. If you don't care about this child, if you're not emotionally attached to them, and they're not doing their job, you can just simply hit them or abuse them in some other capacity. Another way you see this, it shows up as we see in fairy tales. There's always this evil stepmother, and that's really based off historical evidence that stepmothers would come in. They would see their stepchildren as competition for their children and themselves in terms of resources and food and attention from a husband. And so they would find ways to kill them. And the actual father may not have had this emotional attachment to this child, may not care so much that that child is dead. And so you have this real weird time in society where children are almost valueless until they reach adulthood. But there's not a concept of being a child. So it's kind of this tough time when people just don't want to get attached because so many people are dying. This begins to change towards the end of the 18th century. Voltaire pens a famous piece that calls for defense of children. People begin to realize that children are actually different than adults. They have different needs, different wants. And so you see parents starting to give more affection. You see laws that begin to protect children in terms of the amount of time they can work versus time they have off. And you see people giving more attention to children. So you have these kind of changes that begin in the late 18th century when the idea of childhood really begins to develop. In terms of mass literature and school, we have a few major shifts happening here. We see the beginning of education for commoners. And before this, education was really relegated to the higher class. And if you were poor, you were not going to be educated and you were not going to be literate. So that's just the way it was. But beginning in the 1700s, we see shifts here where commoners become more educated. And this tends to start in areas where there's religious conflict, because religious leaders recognize that if they can get their people to read, if they can get their congregations to read, they can pump them full of propaganda. And so they begin to educate the lay people and give them the ability to read and write, and then feed them information about religion. And so you see that there's this massive growth in literacy, mostly beginning with areas where there's religious conflict or kind of an overlap of Protestants and Catholics. In areas that are strictly Catholic, you don't see this as much, but in areas where there's this overlap between Catholics and Protestants, you see it, as well as in Protestant areas, you see it, because this goes back to Luther's idea of reading the Bible. Every believer should have access to the Bible. And so then it shouldn't come as a surprise that Prussia, a heavily Protestant country, leads the way in this literacy movement where they actually begin to require compulsory schooling for children. They make kids go to school, and I believe that starts in 1727. So if you want to blame someone for you having to wake up every morning and go to school, you can blame the Prussians. It was their idea first. So as this education increases, you see literacy growth among all classes. Of course, everyone is still reading the Bible. That is the most common book that is read. And going hand in hand with this Bible are what are called chapbooks, which are printed on cheap paper. And these chapbooks generally have religious overtones and undertones. They're delivering religious meanings. And this gets back to the earlier mention about religious leaders trying to get their congregations to read. In addition, though, to these readings on religion, we start to see the rise of entertaining stories, humor, adventure, fantasy, fairy tales. These all begin to develop in the 1700s and into the 1800s because more people can read, and this is a leisure activity. And so that begins to rise as a popular genre in literature, although it is certainly not nearly as popular as religious texts or this last section we're going to talk about right here, which would be things like almanacs, how-to books, and other informational texts that had practical applications for people who were living at this time. So people would read this informational text in order to better their working and their lives. They would read these religious texts in order to learn more about their religion, and occasionally they would read these entertainments to escape their reality.